As fracking has boomed in the United States over the last 2 decades, so too has an industry practice called flaring. Companies burn off natural gas they aren't selling or for safety and maintenance. When gas isn't burned but released directly into the atmosphere, it's called venting. Both flaring and venting release a dangerous cocktail of greenhouse gases that contribute to global warming and cause health problems. But as lawmakers craft policy to curb climate change, it turns out they don't actually know the true extent of the problem.
Texas is the largest oil and gas producer in the United States. We lead the nation in flaring volumes as well. We actually know how to drive emissions down through leak detection and repair, replacing equipment, all of these sorts of things. So if we're looking at the very big and difficult problem of climate emissions, carbon emissions, methane from the oil and gas industry as a whole is really a low-hanging fruit. Flaring even more so, because it's really simply being driven by profit.
In addition to Texas, North Dakota, and New Mexico are responsible for the vast majority of flaring in the U.S. between 2012 and 2020. But those amounts are obscured by a patchwork of state regulations and loopholes.
So we have one of the oldest regulatory bodies in the country that deals with oil and gas issues, known as the Railroad Commission, which does not actually regulate railroads, but is primarily the regulatory body for oil and gas.
And if you look at the numbers that we report today in flaring, I'm very much reliable on those. I think our people do a very good job of that.
In Texas, companies reported that they flared and vented more than 980 billion cubic feet of gas between 2012 and 2020. But satellite data shows that the amount of flaring alone could be almost twice as high.
These companies are given permits and told they have a certain threshold by which they're allowed to operate. Generally, those permits are already very generous. They're allowed to pollute quite a lot legally. But on top of that, companies routinely violate those permits and put out more pollution than they're allowed to.
Flaring and venting release methane, which is more than 80 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide in a shorter time span. Scientists say cutting methane emissions is the quickest way to slow global warming.
A little bit of smoke is not bad for flaring. You're supposed to see a little bit of smoke. It indicates a good mixture of oxygen in the flame. But if you see too much smoke, that can be bad. That can indicate incomplete combustion. That flare actually concerns me more because you can barely see it, and that might mean that a lot of the gas is not getting combusted. And so there could be more methane coming out off of that flare, but it's not really burning.
TC2, this is Erica. How may I help you?
Hi, Erica. I just wanted to file an air quality complaint.
Who's going to go out there and look at those hundreds of thousands of sites, right? It would take literally an army of people. They don't have enough resources to go out and do that kind of stuff.
Being in a rural town like this, the law is set up to marginalize you. And it's even worse when you're in a population that speaks a different language, and it's really frustrating to see studies come out that show that there's a health impact, that health impact is disparate across lines of ethnicity.
The best evidence is, a study that was done showing that women are more likely to have premature births if they live, close by to flaring operations.
What we found was that the odds of preterm birth, so that's a baby being born too early, was higher, about 50% higher among pregnant individuals that lived what we considered a high amount of flaring close to their home. That association was really strongest amongst the Hispanic or Latinx population.
Cushion's study found that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are disproportionately exposed to flaring.
Well, it's been a way worse flaring on the reservation. You can tell it right here because, like I said, go on the hill. It's worse. 1.5 miles from here is the reservation line. You look east and it's just lit up like a Christmas tree.
In North Dakota, satellite data indicates that from 2012 to 2020, a fifth of all flaring occurred on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation, valued at more than $600 million.
Now, flaring is one of the most important agenda items that I've had for the last 7 years. The reality of this situation is, if you don't capture gas, then nobody benefits. The landowner doesn't get paid, whether it's a tribal members, and oil companies don't get paid for that flaring themselves. Nobody gets paid for a loss of a very valuable resource.
Oil and gas on tribal lands are governed by federal regulators. Attempts to overhaul federal flaring and venting regulations were caught up in years-long litigation, leaving the North Dakota office in limbo.
In the meantime, while they're catching up, when an oil company puts in an application to flare and there's no determinations because they're waiting in queue for a determination to be made, guess what they're going to do with the well? They're going to burn it, right? They're going to flare it. Oil and gas has presented to our nation for the last 10, 11 years an opportunity to get revenue and make significant changes to our economy, to our government, to our welfare. But by no means are we going to sacrifice the long-term good for short-term gain.
A tide may be turning. In 2019, New Mexico elected a new governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham, who reformed state oil and gas rules and reporting requirements.
We are pretty fortunate in the way this administration for New Mexico, I believe, is doing a better job.
For a small state with some pretty interesting challenges, we are in fact leading the country at reducing our emissions and increasing our reliance on renewable energy.
New Mexico gets over $2 billion from the oil and gas industry each year. It'll be hard for the state to disentangle itself from oil and gas interests.
It's not just a 30-year income, it's again a huge piece of the whole economy of your state. The jobs, the activity that it supports, is beyond that $2 billion. They just want to be able to snap their fingers and make it different, and it just doesn't work that way.
In Texas, reform in the industry is even more elusive.
I'd like to be naive and say if we just lobby harder and if we just educate public officials more, that there would be action here or at the Railroad Commission. I think that's naive given our politics. I think it's probably going to take federal action.